If gravity suddenly stopped working on July 3rd, the world would not just change. It would collapse into chaos within seconds. At first, nothing would feel different. People would wake up, walk out of their homes, and begin their normal routines. But the illusion of normality would not last even a moment. The instant gravity disappears, every object that is not firmly attached to something would begin to float. Chairs, tables, cars, animals,
This
water,
is our Milky Way
and even
galaxy.
people would lose
At its
their
core
connection to
lies
the
a
ground.
supermassive
The Earth
black
itself
hole.
would no
It is
longer
known
hold
as
things
Sagittarius
down.
A star.
Oceans would start rising upward in massive floating sheets of water, breaking apart into suspended droplets that drift into the sky. Rivers would no longer flow. Instead, they would dissolve into floating streams, twisting in the air like ribbons of liquid. Cities would become unrecognizable. Buildings would not collapse in the usual sense. They would lose their anchor. Entire structures would begin drifting upward, slowly at first, then faster as wind currents push them. Glass would shatter and scatter in all directions, floating like dangerous glitter through the air. Transportation would become impossible. Cars would float off roads. Airplanes would lose control completely, and trains would drift out of their tracks. Even the atmosphere would begin to escape. Without gravity, the air that keeps every living being alive would slowly leak into space, thinning out every breath. Human beings would experience panic and helplessness. At first, people would float gently upward, try to grab onto anything stable. But there would be no down anymore, no ground, no direction, no stability. Survival would depend on holding on to structures that are also breaking free from Earth. As hours pass, Earth would begin to disintegrate its order. The moon would drift away from its orbit. Satellites would float into deep space. The planet would slowly lose its structure as everything bound by gravity becomes free. Eventually, instant loss of stability. If gravity stops, everything on Earth, including people, objects, and buildings, would immediately start floating without control. The instant gravity stops working, the very idea of standing still would lose meaning. Everything that has ever relied on weight, pressure, and balance would immediately begin to drift. People would no longer feel the familiar pull of the ground beneath their feet. Instead, there would be a sudden and disorienting sensation of lightness, as if the body had forgotten how to belong to Earth. Within the first second, countless small objects, phones, cups, furniture, loose papers, would rise gently into the air as if the world had turned upside down without warning. But there would be no down anymore to define what upside down even means. Human beings would experience a shock that goes beyond fear. The body depends on gravity for orientation. Every step, every breath, every movement is built on the assumption that the ground will always support it. Without that force, muscles would no longer know how to coordinate properly. People trying to stand would find themselves slowly lifting off the floor, not by jumping or falling, but by simply losing connection to the surface. At first, this might feel like floating in water, except there is no resistance, no pressure, no direction to guide movement. The mind would struggle to process what is happening because evolution has never prepared life for a world without gravity. Inside homes, chaos would begin in seconds. Chairs would rise slightly and tilt in unpredictable directions. Tables would drift upward unevenly depending on their weight distribution. A glass placed on a counter would slowly detach and float, spinning gently in the air. Even heavier objects, like refrigerators or beds, would begin to lose their grounding, lifting slowly as if the earth had stopped holding on to them. People inside buildings would instinctively reach for walls, door frames, or anything. Water and oceans would break apart. Rivers and oceans would no longer stay in place, turning into floating, scattered water masses in the air. As time continues after the disappearance of gravity, the situation would shift from immediate shock into a deeper and more terrifying phase of realization. The first moments would have been chaos, but what follows is a slow unfolding of consequences that are far more permanent. The world would no longer feel like a place designed for life. Instead, it would feel like a system that has lost its most basic rule, leaving everything suspended in uncertain motion. In the absence of gravity, the atmosphere itself becomes unstable. Air, which normally stays close to Earth because of gravitational pull, would begin to drift outward. At first, this movement would not be noticeable to the human eye, but the effects would be immediate. Breathing would start to feel different. The density of air would slowly reduce, making every breath slightly more difficult than the last. People would not understand why they feel lightheaded or weak, but the reason would be simple. The invisible layer that keeps oxygen close to the surface is no longer held in place. Temperature regulation would also begin to fail in strange ways. Without gravity-driven air circulation patterns, weather systems would collapse. Winds would no longer follow predictable paths. Storms would not form in the traditional sense, but scattered pockets of air would drift randomly, creating unpredictable bursts of movement. The sky, once a stable dome above, would start to lose its familiar appearance as particles of moisture and dust float upward and disperse into space. Human settlements would become increasingly unlivable. Buildings that once provided shelter would now act like floating shells. Even if some structures remain partially intact, their internal organization would break down completely. Staircases would be meaningless, elevators useless, and corridors disorient. Cities would become unstable. Buildings, vehicles, and infrastructure would drift upward or scatter, making all human-made environments unusable. Transform into something unrecognizable, not through explosion or destruction, but through gradual disassembly. The planet would not crack or burn in a dramatic sense. Instead, it would slowly lose its coherence. Everything that was once held together by invisible force would start drifting apart in layers, as if reality itself is being gently unstitched. The most dramatic change would be the behavior of Earth's oceans. Without gravity, water would no longer remain pressed against the surface. Vast portions of the seas would rise upward in enormous floating masses, forming unstable spheres and broken sheets of liquid suspended in the air. These water structures would not remain stable for long. They would constantly shift, break, and merge again, responding to the slightest movement of air or heat. Eventually, they would begin to escape Earth entirely, drifting outward into space like wandering fragments of a shattered mirror. Marine ecosystems would vanish instantly, not through boiling or freezing, but through separation from their natural environment. Land would also begin to lose its meaning. Soil, sand, and dust would no longer remain compact. The pressure that keeps ground solid depends partly on gravity, and without it, even the most stable terrain would slowly loosen. Fine particles would lift first, forming hazy clouds near the surface. Over time, larger fragments of Earth would follow, creating a slow-motion erosion that moves upward instead of downward. Mountains would not fall. They would unravel.
The ionospheric readings
Valleys
are peaking.
would lose definition as everything becomes
Telemetry is
weightless
locked on.
and unanchored. The atmosphere would now be in a critical state of escape. Air molecules, no longer held close to Earth, would drift into space over time. Atmosphere would escape. Without gravity holding it, the air layer around Earth would slowly leak into space, making survival impossible. As the fourth stage of this unimaginable scenario unfolds, the Earth would have already passed the point of recognizable collapse. What remains is not a planet in crisis, but a drifting remnant of what once was a structured world. The absence of gravity has now fully rewritten the rules of existence, and everything continues to separate, disperse, and dissolve into endless motion. At this point, the planet's core systems are no longer functioning as unified structures. The atmosphere, already thinning, is now in its final phase of escape. Air no longer surrounds the Earth as a stable layer. Instead, it exists as scattered pockets of gas drifting outward into space. Each breath a surviving human takes becomes more artificial than natural, requiring effort to capture and retain oxygen before it floats away. The sky is no longer a ceiling, but an opening a gradual fading boundary between Earth and the void beyond. The oceans, which once defined continents and climates, have now mostly broken apart. What remains are floating reservoirs of water, suspended in vast, irregular shapes. These masses are no longer cohesive enough to be called seas. Some drift together, forming temporary clusters before separating again. Others have already escaped into space entirely, leaving behind dry, exposed land masses that are themselves beginning to disintegrate. The sound of waves, once constant and grounding, no longer exists. In its place is silence interrupted only by slow movement of drifting matter. Land itself has entered its final transformation. The soil, deprived of gravitational pressure, is no longer stable enough to hold form. Dust and mineral particles float freely, creating hazy regions where visibility is reduced. Rocks and geological formations no longer sit firmly in place, but drift in slow arcs, sometimes colliding gently.
Anomalous readings in the ionosphere.
Satellite telemetry confirms it.